walking in a country road, and I've been chasing after my shadow.
Welcome back to the Camino Podcast, episode 112. I'm Dave Whitson.
Nobody asked me my name.
I'm heading out in a few weeks to spend 5 weeks back in northern Spain, chugging along on different parts of the Norte, Ingles, and Mar, doing guidebook updates, and also finally walking the Salvador for the first time. By contrast, it'll be my 8th trip on the Norte over the course of 18 years, which is pretty amazing. No guidebook author dislikes the routes they're covering in their books, at least I hope not. But I'm pretty darn lucky to have gotten the opportunity to build such a long relationship with that one, and I'm excited to return. In the meantime, I'm hoping to get at least a couple more episodes finished before I take off. That Norte series isn't going to complete itself after all. Sometimes episodes become a little cursed. I run into a bunch of dead ends, emails go unanswered, potentially interested guests disappear. And these last two parts have dragged on for a while. I'm doing my best. I'll get there soon. I've also determined that both of the USB-C ports on my laptop have failed, which is inconvenient, and also the reason for the microphone issues that have beset this latest batch of episodes. Sorry again about that. I'll have to send it in for repairs, and the Spain trip will be a good opportunity to get that done at a non-disruptive moment. Here's hoping we'll be back to decent audio quality later in the year. Okay, on to this episode. I've had a couple conversations lately with priests, Father Brendan McManus and Father Johannes Schwartz, and those have been great. It got me thinking, though, about bringing on a pair of pilgrims from the other side of the religious spectrum, an atheist and an agnostic, to see how they engage with belief and other spiritual elements on the Camino. So in this episode, I'm joined by Leonard Vance of Tucson, Arizona, and Rian Sassin of Brooklyn, New York. Leonard is the author of An Atheist on Pilgrimage, Tales of Humanity from the Camino de Santiago, while Rian recently had an essay published in The Nation titled Walking the Camino in the Shadow of Belief. Together, they speak to the value of losing yourself on pilgrimage, the calming of the mind, and the ways that the Camino did and didn't reshape their beliefs. This is one of those episodes where I could have just hit record, kicked up my feet for an hour, and watched the magic happen. Leonard and Rian made it that easy. I'm sure you'll agree. Leonard and Rian, thank you both for joining me for this conversation. I am excited about it because it's kind of an experiment, bringing you both together here, coming at your Caminos from these very different vantage points, but also there's a very clear thread running through, and I'm curious to see how it plays out here. So you both have relatively recent publications on your journeys on different branches of the Camino. And let's just start with the basics. Where did you walk? When did you walk? And did you have any background with the Camino prior to that recent walk? And Rian, let's start with you for this one.
So I walked the Camino in the summer of 2023. My first day on it was, I believe, July 4th. It took me about 5 weeks, so I finished up around the first week of August. And I think I had heard of the Camino before. I had mentioned it kind of a little bit in that essay of mine that, I went to Catholic school growing up. I was raised Catholic, but I haven't been practicing in many years. And so I think it was something I was kind of like aware it existed, but, I still ended up seeing it on a social media feed. I think it was, I really can't, it might have been like a Reddit thread under like Reddit travel or something. It might have been Twitter. I can't quite remember, but I was in kind of a transitional moment in my life. I had worked in magazines for about a decade here in New York. I had gone back to graduate school. I was doing an MFA in creative writing and fiction at NYU. It was an amazing experience. It was fully funded. And I was also in just a relationship that was breaking down. And I had, a book, a novel, and a short story collection that was being rejected by seemingly every editor in New York. And I was kind of like, oh man, like my life is just really there's just a lot of rejection on kind of every level of it right now. And it's funny, a friend of mine here in New York who it's like the one practicing Catholic I know. She was got very serious when she heard that I was going to do it. She's like, "You have a calling. That was a calling. Whatever social media post you saw." And I was like, "Okay, sure." I mean, I have many complicated feelings about the question of faith and belief as this essay goes into, but it did feel, I felt kind of pulled to do it. I felt compelled. It just felt like the right thing to do at that moment in my life.
Leonard, how about you? Where, when, and did you have any background before you set out?
I have a very close friend. And one day he said, I just saw a movie at the loft and I think you want to come see it. So we went and we watched The Way, which is, I guess, 15 years old now. And I can still remember walking outside afterwards and kind of being a little bit wobbly and going, oh, I'm going to have to do that. And it just sort of reached out and grabbed me. It was 7 years until we walked. We had to retire first. Then when we did, Mike and I, we got out there. Made it to Vienna. And he got up the next morning and he said, "This isn't right for me." And he got in a cab and he went home. So I kind of took a deep breath. Well, we're still very close friends. And I said, okay, I guess I'm continuing to walk. And so I did. And it was at that point in time, instead of a journey between the two of us, which we were used to doing, climbed Mount Whitney and done stuff like that, it became just what I was walking. And it grabbed me so much that I couldn't stop talking about it. Eventually, my youngest child decided they wanted to do it. And so we went back in 2019. And then I still can't quite figure out why I wanted to do it so badly, but I went back and I said, I'm going to walk north from Gibraltar in 2023. So that was 2 months before, we probably arrived in Santiago, not that far from each other. And in that one, it just kind of hit me upside the head about halfway through why I was walking. And so I was struggling with all of that for several hundred kilometers trying to figure out what to do with it. And when it was done, there was enough of a story. I said, I'm an engineer. I'm coming from a very different place than you are, right? But there's a story that just kind of has to be told. And there was a number of people in the local pilgrim group here that, they encouraged me. They gave me a pen and they said, don't come back until you've got well, they didn't say it, but it was encouraged. And so that's when I ended up starting writing. I'm not sure I've gotten actually to the nub of the whole thing. And maybe you have some more experience with this. And we're trying to figure out how to describe the essence of the Camino experience. And all I can feel is I'm kind of nudging around the corners of it. And I can get to places that are meaningful sometimes, but I don't know anybody who's ever figured out how to get to the real center of it. Singing, have you had that frustration?
In some ways, yes. I think that I still feel very moved by the experience, and I still think about the experience a lot. And when I am attempting to articulate it, be it in real life or in my writing, I find that what I keep coming back to is that it feels a bit like stepping out of time in an odd way. Sort of the forward movement of time. You're obviously moving forward with step by step, unless you're doing it backwards, which I know some pilgrims at the end do go backwards, and I passed by a few of them. But it does feel like this sort of like liminal space of anything can happen. I had strange stories that occurred that I didn't end up fitting into this essay, but there was one that I did mention in the essay that, it was just a funny moment, but a Camino friend and I were kind of walking along, and this group of people on horseback came by us, and this was close to Santiago. And, they were very kind of like, oh, like Peregrinos, very excited, but it felt almost like medieval in this strange way. I was telling this to a very good friend. I was talking about this with a good friend last night, and he was just like, how did this happen? Like, are you imagining this? Like, this sounds like you were on drugs or something. And I was like, I wasn't. It just felt surreal and this strange, you feel like you're kind of fitting into these outlines that have been, you're almost a paper doll slotting into these outlines that are there in the past, the present, the future.
I think there's a book called Into the Thin. And it was given to me by a friend. I don't know if you've seen that one or not. But out there in the Meseta, towards the end, I'm not sure. I mean, there's something innate in humans, and here I know I'm starting to nudge into the religious or the spiritual a little bit because I'm not. I'm a scientist. And I'm the flavor of atheist that says, if somebody showed me evidence tomorrow that there was a supreme being, I would say, okay, I'll accept that because that's what I do. But for me, that hasn't happened. And so I said, okay, I'm going to have at least the firmness of belief from a scientific standpoint that there is no supreme being, but there is something innate in me. And I think with most humans, and maybe the only thing that separates us from the animals, maybe, is that you want to have that contact with things that are maybe outside normal experience. And I didn't realize it until my third Camino how much I craved that. That feeling that you were having when the horseman came by and you suddenly felt the connection to almost a medieval circumstance. I feel like I understand that. And it hit me a lot, especially on my third one, because it was so long. I would put my ear up to these monuments in the last third, and it would be stone, but I feel like I could start to hear the sound of the other pilgrims that had walked there over the centuries as they were walking by, and their conversations and things that they were feeling and talking about. And after a while, it started to come very easily. And so that's what that author called the thin. It's the place where the boundary between the objective world that we normally live in and that which is beyond, it's not very thick. And so you start to experience it. And I think that's what I started to get. And I actually crave it, despite the fact that I know my brain is just hallucinating. This is not real in any sense that you could measure something, but it's definitely someplace where my brain wanted to go.
You said you've done multiple Caminos. Was it on the first Camino that you had, I mean, the phrase religious experience is a bit cliche, but did you have this sort of moment of something?
Yeah, there was a very distinct one. I was on the way to Hospital de Abrigo. It's a long day. You probably remember it. It's a 39-kilometer day if you go on the left route. And because I don't like roads, I go on the left route. I am just going through the heat of the day, and my brain is elsewhere. I'm on a road that is pretty much to the horizon in both directions, front and in back of me. And suddenly I'm knocked over sideways by a blast of dust and wind. And I'm going, whoa, what's happening? And so I'm looking around at myself and I realize, oh, I'm in the middle of a dust devil. And I could look up for a moment. There's a little spot of blue sky up above. And then the back end of the dust devil hits me and knocks me forward a little bit. And I hold my breath and it passes on and it goes tearing out through the wheat fields to my left. And is like this voice in my head that says, you really ought to pay more attention to where you're walking, Pilgrim. And so it's like, okay. So
Wow.
voices in my head just don't happen every day. And so I think that was the first time I was really aware of it. And the funny thing, every day after that, I would look out into the fields. I could see all these little dust devils moving around, even through Galicia, through the ferns and whatnot. They kind of became things that I knew about and saw every day. It's almost like somebody is watching over me now. And so you get that feeling. I think everybody has these kinds of stories from the Camino. It just sort of happens to most of us when we're out there.
It's funny what happens. I map out a plan for a conversation and I figure that first question, concrete, it'll be about 2 minutes, then we'll move into things. And here we are about 20 minutes later. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit. We've dived like right into the heart of things. I wanted to go back and just do a little bit more table setting or examination of some of the table setting that you have done in that back and forth just now. Rian, your article is titled Walking the Camino in the Shadow of Belief. I know authors don't always get to pick their titles in publications,
Yeah.
but the word shadow certainly has connotations. It's very different than maybe having the title be Walking in the Light of Belief, for example. And you've alluded to your relationship with Catholicism, but still, could you talk more about that? How did faith and belief influence your decision to undertake a pilgrimage, and how did that manifest on the walk itself?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I didn't pick that title. My editor did. But I mean, I love my editor. She was really great. She provided great edits for that piece. And I would say that the idea of belief is something that is definitely very interesting to me. I mentioned that I was in an MFA program when I was doing this, and I had chosen to do that to go back to school because I had a couple of different manuscripts I was trying to finish. And one of them specifically is a book that is currently being kind of, my agent has sent it to editors. Maybe it'll be published. The industry is very complicated. It's tough to sell literary fiction right now, but it's a book called The Table Wrappers, like wrapping on a table. And it's about a computer scientist named Rob, and he ends up having an acrimonious divorce from a photographer in New York. It's the early 2010s. He goes back to Boston, where he's originally from, and becomes swept up in a series of seances through an old college friend, becomes obsessed with proving the psychic to be a fraud. It's based kind of loosely on Harry Houdini did this in the 20s with a psychic named Mina Crandon in Boston. And I was thinking about that a lot because I was thinking about, the relationship between art, technology, rationality versus belief. I think that we are in a moment, a cultural moment in which there's a lot of questions about what constitutes a human, what constitutes consciousness. Is there life after death? There's a really great book actually that I was reading at the time from this contemporary science journalist called God, Human, Animal, Machine, Technology, Metaphor, and the Search for Meaning by Megan O'Giblin. It's a really fabulous book. I recommend it. And she kind of covers a lot of this territory of the relationship between belief, self, what technology is telling us, the rise of artificial intelligence. I was thinking about that a lot because one of the arguments that she has in this that I think is very interesting and that I think about a lot is the way that we use so much metaphoric language we talk about how the mind is a machine, but the mind literally is not a machine. We are not computers. We use computers every day at this point. We're using a computer right now. I'm in debt to my computer, but I was also exhausted by my computer. I think there's definitely a backlash going on. I think that right now people are very sick of their screens, trying to get back into real life in a way. I think the Camino for myself was a bit related to that too, getting to just not be on my phone, not be on my computer, to be in real life. It was related also to my father died when I was 16, and I just turned 33 when I walked the Camino. I was having a lot of questions about just mortality. I remember having a phone conversation with my mother around that time, and she said, well, you're at the age 32, 33, where you really begin to realize that you're going to die someday, even if you've seen someone die in your life, but you do kind of realize at that age, like, oh, this isn't forever. And so I think I was, a bit petrified by that, having a bit of an existential crisis surrounding that. That's sort of what moved me in some ways. I think also, the idea of belief is something that's very fascinating to me. I write about in this essay, I write about in this novel I just mentioned that, growing up, going to Catholic school, growing up culturally Catholic, there's a sense of a rhythm to your life that even if you're not very observational, if you don't believe in anything, like there's still just sort of this understanding of the world. And not necessarily having that as an adult when you're kind of thinking these questions probably compelled me to think about, again, like I was saying, my own relationship with time, technology, life, thinking about belief also as this moment in time is a political issue, a global issue. I talk about believing in belief in that essay, which for me, there's a really great phrase from the British writer E.M. Forster, had an essay, What I Believe, published in the 30s, actually by The Nation, in which he is talking about, the rise of political authoritarianism. And the first line is, I do not believe in belief. But he goes on to say that unfortunately, he's in an age of belief, belief in certain tyrannies, belief in certain, he was an atheist. He thinks of religion in this context as well. And so what to do then in those moments when you're confronted by belief? His solution is essentially to believe in democracy, to believe in art, to believe in interpersonal relationships. And that's an essay that's been very important to me since I first read it when I was an undergraduate years ago. And so I think that all of this was sort of fermenting together, compelling me to go on this sort of journey. And the thing that really lit the fuse then was, for the first time in over a decade, I had some time off. I had a summer off. I was on a student schedule. I had this relationship that was falling apart with someone who eventually cheated on me, and it was just not a good relationship. So I thought, well, I need to get out of here. I need to get out of New York. This seems to be the solution.
Leonard, you have mentioned you self-identify as an atheist. That's not just part of your identity. You lead with it in the title of your book, An Atheist on Pilgrimage. And I think you had more control over the title maybe than Rhian did with her article.
I'm self-published, and so I had complete control over everything. Although, yeah, there are people in my life that influenced it. Absolutely.
So what compels an atheist to go on 3 Caminos?
Darned if I could figure it out at first. It just called me. And after the movie, I think I've talked about that, and I really didn't know. But in the end, after that third one, I think I started to understand a little bit. Even though I purport to be a scientist and an atheist from the standpoint that evidence says that there's no supreme being out there, there's a part of me that really wants that all to be true, or some aspects of it to be true. And there are friends of mine that look and say, hey, well, sort of friends that say, Leonard, God is calling you. That's what's happening when you hear that. My flip response is, well, who's God exactly? There are a number of them, right? But no, the more important answer is that, yeah, I hear that. And I think it's part of being human, that we have that metaphysical, we have that spiritual aspect that calls us. And it's part of what makes us good at being together, not just as individuals, each striving to get the most money or the best reputation, but to be part of a larger community. It's one of the things that makes that happen. So in the end, I crave that. And I can only really get it on the Camino, and only after a long amount of walking by myself. I think that's why I go back. There are other reasons as well, but I think that might actually be the nub of it, as close as I can tell.
Rhian, as you set out, you framed the Camino this way in your article. The pilgrimage is perhaps the truest distillation of one of the principal aims of this kind of walking, that of losing oneself. And I imagine that some listening are surprised by that, confused by that, viewing it as being entirely the opposite, an opportunity to find oneself. So tell me about your thinking behind that line, an opportunity to lose oneself.
Well, that's so fascinating, thinking that people might think the opposite. No, but I totally see what you're saying. I was thinking of it also in the context of walking and different forms of walking. I was thinking, I talk about kind of in the beginning of, the French Situationist, flipping a coin to decide by chance how you're walking through the city. This idea of the dérive that Guy Debord came up with, this idea of sort of drifting through a city. I was thinking of, the flaneur, the urban kind of walker that became very important to literature, kind of the rise of the city. You see the flaneur first appearing in the poetry of Baudelaire. So I was thinking of that kind of walker is many eyes are on him or her. Lauren Elkin has a great book called The Flaneuse, which is thinking about, can a woman be a flaneur? And so it's a different type of walking. Whereas this sort of walking, you're in nature, you are obviously meeting a lot of people, you're creating a community every day, but it also is sort of you don't have the noise or presence of the city around you. And so it becomes a different type of walking. And because you're walking, 25, 30 kilometers a day, I lost toenails, my feet were bleeding. I definitely had packed too much in my bag, the classic first Camino mistake. And so it was at times incredibly unenjoyable. It was really hard sometimes.
By the way, packing too much is not just your first Camino error.
Oh no.
Second and third as well. Hate to tell you.
Okay. So yeah, I think I was thinking of it in the context of other types of walking that I have always found really interesting, and other kinds of walking that, I go on a lot of really long walks in New York City. I mean, like around this time last year, I did a really fun walk that was from the very top of Manhattan to the very bottom in one day. I think that walking, especially, as a writer, it's how you come up with ideas. You're thinking about walking, you're thinking about what you're working on, kind of the rhythm of the each step forward. Virginia Woolf has a really amazing essay about walking in London in wintertime and thinking about, writing during that. So to me, this kind of very long distance walking in nature, a pilgrimage that has this destination, it's not just an aimless kind of drifting through an urban landscape. That to me felt like a different type of walking in which I just didn't have eyes on me in the same way that I do in the city. If I'm on the subway, you're anonymous, but you also are really surrounded by people. And so that anonymity becomes something that you can embrace. I mean, I've cried on the subway multiple times. Someone once told me that's when you know you're a real New Yorker, if you've cried in public in New York. But it's also kind of exhausting sometimes to feel that there are just so many people around you.
Leonard, I read your book with Rianne's words in mind, and it occurred to me, obviously in a very literal sense, you were losing yourself on the Via Serrana, but figuratively as well, it seemed like at times you were going through that process of losing yourself early on that walk.
Yeah, I read those words. It stood out to me as well because it was a good description of what I felt like happened to me. And I suspect to a lot of us. You may think you know why you're going out there. You may think that you've got a good story and you will tell people that. And then suddenly you're not so sure. And so I'm not sure you ever really find yourself. No, I never found myself. But it was a great privilege. That's not the right word. It was just really important to let myself wander, my brain wander, and to just let it get lost. Yeah, when I read those words in your essay, it did strike me. It's a good description.
I love that phrase, it's being important to let yourself wander.
Leonard, I'd love for you to take us. There's a pivotal moment in your account where you sit down, you take a break, and then just out of nowhere, you hit a wall. What happened?
I don't know to this day, but I was on day 15. I started in Gibraltar and I had walked north on a rough trail up to Sevilla. There is no Camino. Well, there is a official Camino, but I'm not sure anybody ever walks it from Gibraltar north. And I was in my second day up north of Sevilla, and it was a 30-kilometer day, and it was hot, and the cars were going by fast. And so it was just an other day in southern Spain. And I sat down and I said, okay, let's just have some lunch. My brain just absolutely kind of exploded. I can't, it's hard to describe. It's like I'm sitting there, I'm peeling an orange, just like I normally do, having some water, and all of a sudden my brain screams at me that we're done. I mean, I am done with this whole, I can't say the word on radio. I'm done with this whole thing. And it's like I'm sitting here looking around because I'm in the middle of nowhere and I haven't seen another pilgrim in 3 hours. And it's like this stranger has just burst out in the middle of my head and is screaming at me. And it's like, where the heck did this come from? Nothing like that has happened to me before or since. And I was absolutely certain to just get me into a taxi. I am out of here. It came out of nowhere with no warning. And this is my third Camino, right? It's not like I haven't done this before. And it eventually come to the realization that there's no way out. I have to get up and I have to walk to Almadén de la Plata because that's the only place that I can go, or that's the nearest place I can go today to find another human. And so I eventually had to do it. And I still do not know. I don't understand what fundamentally happened. But that rest of that day, it was through a cork forest, and I can hardly remember it. I mean, my vision was down to this little tunnel. It was just focused, one step in front of the other, staying on the trail. I can get to where I need to go, and I can stop, right? And I am thinking to myself, oh my God, I had a friend of mine who'd given me some electrolytes because I was drinking straight water and it was hot. And I probably ought not to have been doing that. And he said, so I'll take out James' electrolytes. I'll pour it into my water bottle. And that probably, because physically, felt like something was happening, felt like something was not right. So I'll give that a try. And I reach back and for my extra water bottle, and it's gone because I left it in Monasterio 22 kilometers back. And I said, oh crap, now I'm down a liter of water too. And so I still had water because I had the Camelback. I walked on in kind of a daze, real angry. It seemed like it was dark, even though it was middle of the day. And I'd come to a place in the road where I hadn't seen anybody for a long time, and there's a water bottle in the middle of the road. It's just, it's one of those plastic ones. It's been emptied out. It's been placed in the middle of the road. It's been there for, I don't know, couldn't have been more than 30 seconds because it hadn't even started to develop any condensation on the inside. It's like, okay. So I said, I don't know where this came from, but I put the water in and I put the electrolytes in. I drank it and it got much worse. I really don't know what was going on, Dave. Physically, something was happening, but it was emotionally just crazy. And so I just was worried that I was maybe going to lose consciousness. I wandered around, not wandered. I stayed on the trail, but after half an hour, started to stabilize. And a couple hours later, I'm in front of El Medina La Plata, and my friend takes me aside and says, hey, how do those electrolytes work? And I go, well, so he asked me after that story if I was going to walk any further. And I said, yeah, I'm continuing on. And that's another question. I have no idea when that decision was made. It just sort of popped out of my head. So I kept walking. But yeah, it was violent. I had never experienced anything like that before in my life. I still don't know what happened.
It's interesting that the water bottle appeared out of nowhere. I heard a story a little bit like that on my Camino, actually, in which it was early on. It was in kind of like the wine country area. There was this German woman who, I said goodbye as I was staying in one place overnight, and she was like, "Oh, I'm going to go a little further." And apparently, I heard then later on that and when we were talking, she was like, "Oh, I'm going to go on a little bit later, but my feet are really hurting. My shoes." She had these very brand new hiking boots. She's like, "They weren't the right decision. Like they're not broken in." And I was like, "Well, good luck." Didn't think about it. And then I heard later on, halfway through when I was on the Meseta, that she had been, sitting down on the side of the road shortly thereafter, was in a lot of pain, was sort of like, oh gosh, like how am I going to get to this next place? And then looked over, and near her on the side of the road was a pair of sneakers in her size. She was like, oh my gosh, like where did these come from? She asked people that were going by, and they were like, I have no idea where they came from. And finally she's like, okay, I guess I'm going to wear them to get to this town. I heard this story and I kind of dismissed it. And I was like, oh, that's like slightly ridiculous, these Camino legends. And then in Santiago, I was getting a drink with this young German guy that I had first been walking with at the beginning of the Camino. And I was like, hey, like, because he was talking about, he had met up with a bunch of other Germans at one point. And I was like, oh, did you know this woman? And like this story, can you corroborate it? And he was like, oh, that actually happened. Yeah, no, she's like one of my like Camino family now. And the sneaker thing absolutely happened. I mean, to this day, I guess I believe that. I didn't talk to her. I haven't fact checked this, but these bizarre things happen.
Yeah, I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it's because we're more receptive and we want that kind of thing to happen, that we notice it more. But yeah, I carried that bottle with me all the way to Mooksha. So yeah, it became kind of an icon for me. And if you read to the end of the book, it becomes part of the story in the end. After a while, it became representative of the burdens that I was carrying. And I still remember there was a voice in my head when I saw that bottle. And it's just like this tunnel vision, and there's just a bottle on the ground. And this voice in my head goes, okay, Peregrino, pick up the bottle, fill it up with water, and drink it because I ain't done with you yet.
Wow.
These things, they really did happen in my head. Are they real? Well, what does real mean when you're out there sometimes, right?
Absolutely.
Rian, you wrote at one point that I had imagined the Camino as a form of escapism. What it offered instead was a confrontation. And Leonard has just described a very powerful confrontation. What did you confront along the way?
The answer that comes immediately to mind is a sort of a moment that I think I write about in that essay, but it was right before, you know, that part where it's like the first 2 weeks and it's like the up and down all the hills and people call it the knee crusher.
Yeah.
It was like that part. And so I was literally just looked at my email and there was an email from New York that I got another rejection on this book that had been sent out. And I was like, God, what is going on with like my professional life, my love life? Everything's going horribly. I have lost 3 toenails, like everything's in pain. I mean, I was a moment of hubris too. I thought, oh, like I live in New York. I walk everywhere. Like this shouldn't be that hard. And of course, you know, walking everywhere in a city is different than walking 30 kilometers in one day. And so I was just really miserable. And I got to the top of a hill and it just felt like everything had really, all in that moment, I checked my email. I was just like, what am I doing? I just started bawling, just crying. There's no one around me. I was just letting it out for like 10 minutes. And I felt much better afterwards. And I got to Logroño and I was like, you know what? I'm going to have a rest day. And I just decided to have 1 or 2 rest days. And it's interesting when you do allow yourself to have a rest day, you know, you end up meeting different people. You know, everyone's rhythm gets staggered. People that I started off with, then I lost until the end, or maybe I never saw them again, or other people that then would become more of my Camino family I met later on. But yeah, I just felt really kind of like, yeah, hitting a wall in a sense, as you kind of mentioned, Leonard, and just feeling like I've had enough. Why am I doing this? And then I took a bus from Logroño to Burgos because I was kind of like, I just have to, like, I'm losing time. You know, my flight back was already booked. Like, I knew when I'd be getting back to America. And I was kind of like, I do have to make it within this span of time. So I also had some plans to be in Barcelona for a couple of days at the end. And I was just like, you know what? Like, I'm not going to beat myself up for taking a bus and like skipping over 3 days. And so then I did that. I started the Meseta a few days later, and the Meseta became my favorite part of the Camino. It was amazing. I met my Camino family. I had a lot of really beautiful moments on it. And it was also flat, which was really nice.
What's interesting to me about all of this is, we've just talked about these high intensity moments for each of you, but then you both also write about the calming of the mind and the emptying of the mind. You wrote, Rihanna, about wanting a blankness of the mind. Leonard talks about this sustained process as well of getting to that point where things could be calm. How do you achieve that on the Camino? I think a lot of people are craving it. How does the Camino allow that to unfold?
You know, I think it's an interesting question because I feel like for the first few weeks of the Camino, the first 2 weeks, these moments that I've just described were kind of the exact opposite. Like I couldn't stop thinking and torturing myself with my thoughts. And then it was truly that moment that I kind of hit that wall and cried a lot and then took a rest that things started getting better for me. And that was kind of the pivotal transitional moment of me. Because I also then remember very distinctly having some thoughts on the top of that hill and realizing, you know, all of these things that I want very badly are out of my control. And, you know, it might be a cliche in some ways, but cliches are cliches for reasons. There is a kernel of truth to it that once you stop trying to control things, life will unfold the way that it does. And I think it was this realization that I couldn't control everything because I'm a very type A person. I've planned everything in my life out. You can't plan everything, and just letting go of that. It was really hard. It's still hard sometimes to let go of that, but I feel like that was my big Camino lesson that I still think about, just kind of letting things unfold.
Leonard, how about you? How did it work?
It feels familiar. My first Camino, it was a little bit further down the road in Burgos when I kind of figured that I had to let go and I took that extra day. My feet were in such pain. My best friend had gotten up 3 or 4 days earlier and had taken a cab home, and I was walking by myself. And I had found a group of people that I really liked walking with, but I couldn't keep up with them. My feet hurt too much. They were walking faster than I was. It was not good. It was to the point where I had to stop about once every 100 meters as I was walking into Burgos that one particular day. At that point, I kind of got to a place where I let go and I said, okay, I can't control who I'm going to walk. I mean, I can choose to stay with people that I want to walk with, but it's not working. And I just said, okay, I'm just going to walk the way that I want to. And people are going to come into my life and they're going to go, and I'm going to have to let some things go. And it really freed me up to just think about things that I wanted to think about. I think it enabled a lot of the more interesting things that happened later on. I had a 33-year career and I worked hard and I wanted to be successful. And every one of those moments, maybe this happens with everybody to some extent more than others, but I think of all those moments I made a bad decision. Those bad moments, they come back and they haunt you. I was able to start letting go. And after that third Camino, and after that really hard day walking to Almaden de la Plata, I made a promise to myself. I just go, your brain, you want to think about that bad moment 30 years ago when I said something stupid? Yeah, go ahead. I'm not going to push you away into something more productive. Have at it. We got all day. We got weeks if you want. And I think that gave me a steadiness and an acceptance of myself after a while that I didn't have before. It was an important outcome.
There's a line in your book that jumped out at me, just flashing lights. You write, I wondered if I was experiencing something close to what Christians call grace. It is pretentious, that word, and I don't like it, especially its religious connotations. But how else to describe this state of mind?
Yeah, that happened. You probably had some good moments in Galicia as well. This was a morning coming down out of Tricastella on the backside of Osabreo. And it was one of those mornings when the clouds were wandering around just in touch with the treetops. It was just absolutely stunning, beautiful. And it was a dawn moment. It was gray. And I just found myself with absolutely no pre-thought at all, starting to forgive the people that I thought had done me wrong over the years. So that took quite a while because I'm Irish. And eventually it got to my ex-wife. And so that took a little bit longer. None of this was planned. It just popped into my head and it started happening while all this beauty was going by me. And then at the end, that voice comes up in my head again. And it doesn't do that very often. It says, well, you got to forgive yourself too. And I had to stop and think about that for a while. And I just stopped in the trail and I went, what does that mean? And I didn't, it was all a stranger because, everybody else says, well, of course that's going to happen. But I didn't realize it was going to happen. And so after a while, I started walking again. And I said, okay, I think I can do that. But after that happened is when I felt like I could walk in that state. The physics of the body were working okay in the morning. It was relatively cool. I mean, if there was any pain, it didn't work, but I could walk in that place where I was completely at comfort with myself for the first time in my life. It was a remarkable feeling. And so that's what I referred to. I don't know what else to call it besides grace. And I can still bring it back at certain moments when I'm walking by myself now. It's an important gift that got given to me when I was on that first Camino.
Rian, looking back at your journey, obviously you had a lot of things that you were grappling with when you set out on the Camino. You mentioned that one of the things was that childhood relationship with Catholicism that had shifted over time. How did these weeks on the Camino, on a route that is embedded with so much Catholic tradition, influence your outlook on faith?
One immediate piece of information is that, so I went to Mass for the first time since I was 16 when I was on the Camino. And the Camino is the last time I've been to Mass, which is 3 years ago. So, I mean, I'm not a practicing Catholic, but I mean, I talk about it in this essay a bit too, but if you're raised within the tradition, I think there's a level of like it imprints on your life in a way. But I found that my belief system is similar. What's that line from Hamlet? There are more things on earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And I do think that, I think there's a truth to that of I'm not an atheist. I guess I'm an agnostic. I think that especially, when I was talking earlier about these questions today of art versus technology, rationality versus irrationality. We've seen it. I mean, this is a very old human conversation that's been repeated through. I mean, you can see, romanticism as a backlash to the Enlightenment, and then like so on and so on. I would say that writing is such a central part of who I am as a writer, and there are moments that, if you're writing and suddenly there are paragraphs that, and this is a very, very rare thing when it happens. Usually writing is thinking about it, you're processing it, you're crossing things out, you're drafting, you're redrafting. But these spectacular moments when they happen are very rare, when it's almost like the words are imprinted in your skull and you're just copying them down. It's like you see them, and it's a very, very rare thing. And I feel like that is something that, again, I mean, a lot of my friends are writers. We've talked about it. I think that this is true for people within other forms of art, with other genres of art. I think that they have their equivalent. But I guess that for me, the question of art, art is what makes us human. That's what separates us from technology. It's again these anxieties that we have today surrounding artificial intelligence, the computer technology. Are the humanities going to be replaced? I don't think that will happen. And that's because, again, art is what separates us from, machines, from technology, from animals. And so for me, I think that walking the Camino and having these experiences and then writing about them kind of reaffirms my sense of belief in something beyond just what is the material realm.
I don't want to overstate the significance of that one moment. Obviously, you have just focused on what is for you the most salient takeaway from that experience in terms of your beliefs. I'm curious, though, what it was like going back and having that experience at Mass on the Camino for the first time in so many years. What did you take from that evening?
Well, it was such a funny experience too, because I mean, we live in a post-Vatican II world. When I was going to Catholic school, it was the 90s and early 2000s, and so I mean, everything was in Spanish, and I grew up with the English language mass. It was kind of like, oh, what's going on? Like, oh, right, I have to like kneel down at this part. But it was interesting. I went with there's a Camino friend of mine who she was American, but she'd been raised, I think, Methodist, and she was a Protestant. She was kind of like, oh, like, I want to go to Mass with you. And I was like, sure. Like, just so you know, I don't understand what the priest is saying. But there's a very interesting moment then. I was on the Meseta and I was in an albergue that was run by nuns, an order of sisters. And it was really spectacular because the nuns were taking part in the Mass in a very unusual way that I hadn't seen. And I think that, I mean, as a woman, like, the Catholic Church is famously not always been the kindest to us. I think I mentioned this in my essay, but I dropped out of confirmation like a week before it was supposed to happen because I got into an argument with my confirmation teacher about abortion. This was like 2003. So I was kind of like, I'm not doing this. And then at the end, I went to a big, pilgrim mass in Santiago. That was a very fascinating experience. My essay kind of ends on that with this strange experience I had with some woman that disappeared in the crowd afterwards. And then after that, I ended up going to an English language mass with the same Camino friend I had mentioned who had wanted to go to these with me. It was a lovely experience. It was a very emotional experience. It was a bunch of people who had just finished the Camino, and it was again very interesting. It was a Filipino priest who was really emphasizing the role of women in the church, which I was like, okay, I see that there's some PR that's going on. He had this really great line of, your real Camino is just beginning. Life is the Camino. Like, you have just finished this journey, but you're going to take the actual Camino with you. And yeah, I mean, immediately after finishing the Camino, my life kind of fell apart 2 months later.
Oh, no.
But it was good. It was sort of, I don't know if you know anything about tarot cards. It was like the Tower moment, which, like, the Tower is a tarot card that like destroys everything, but things are like clean and fresh afterwards. You needed to destroy something to begin anew. So it was really, really hard afterwards, but in a good way. I'm in a much better place in my life.
Leonard, after all of the experiences with mystery, with the encounters that defy rational thought, has there been any eroding of your sense of self as an atheist?
No, it's an important question. And the basic answer is no. But I want to tell a story, which is that my great grandparents were founding members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So part of, I think, what's called the Second Awakening in American history. They raised the family and a large family, common at the times, but my grandfather didn't take. And he rebelled at the age of 18 after he ate his first hamburger, in his own telling, and said that there was no chance that he was going to be a Seventh-day Adventist after that experience. But he raised a group of kids and grandkids that were kind of anti-religious. And I carried that with me for most of my life. Maybe even through my first two Caminos to some extent, but something happened in this third one, and I'm not entirely sure when, but there was this realization that, it's an innate thing for humans to want to believe in these things that are outside the rational. And then I had a realization that we're all like that. But the way that we express it, or at least most of us do, is through religion. And you get to have a belief system and get to choose which religion you want to be. So in some ways, spiritualism is innate human, and religion is what men have decided to do with it. And I do mean men, because it's very rare that it's anybody else but the men that have decided what the religion actually means and what the rules are, right? And I had that realization. I said, okay, but then I also had the realization is that, yeah, that belief is going to be there. And so it's more important to me now what you decide to do with that belief and what your values are than what your belief system is so much. When I see a bishop or I see a priest doing things that are important and good and brave in our current political environment, I'm going, I'm actually kind of with you. And so it hasn't changed my belief system, but it has changed my tolerance is not really the right word. I have accepted that belief that I want to do that within my own self. And I've accepted people around me. If they share the same kind of values that I have, then that's what really matters.
Let's finish here. I have one last question. It's broad, it's open-ended. I invite you to take it from whatever angle you like. There are always some people drawn to the Camino who worry that they will be out of place as non-believers, or that they might have religion foisted upon them in this context. And there are also non-believers or lapsed believers who want to revisit the matter of faith, to explore it, but don't know how to engage with that process on the Camino. So again, from whichever angle or angles and all of that connects with you or speaks to you, I'd like to invite you to offer some suggestions on how to engage or not to engage with religious or spiritual matters on the Camino.
I think it's totally up to the pilgrim what they want to do. I think that there's space for everyone. I met people from every walk of life, people from countries that are historically, not Catholic or Christian, people who were never Catholic and who had no like religious ties to it and were doing it to find something out about themselves, I would say, but not necessarily for a religious purpose. There was some like very conservative French Catholics walking along my walk as well, which was fascinating to see. There's a Mexican priest who was on his Camino, which he was a really, really lovely person. I remember he was walking in a group that was with like this Australian woman who was an atheist and like three other people. It was like a whole hodgepodge of people. And so I think that is kind of the strength of the Camino too. There's a diversity to it. To the point that was made earlier in this podcast, you start the Camino thinking that you're walking for one thing, and you find out at the end that maybe your journey is taking you somewhere completely different. I remember I was in Galicia, I was near the end. I was so tired of walking. I just wanted to go home. I was done with the Camino. I had this kind of amazing moment that it was this really beautiful albergue that I was born in Ireland. I'm a dual citizen. And so I was walking on my Irish passport, and some Irish pilgrim had paid it forward for whoever had an Irish passport got to stay in this albergue for free, which was really amazing. I was kind of, I was in such a bad mood that sort of like restored my faith in the Camino itself, I guess. And then it was just a really lovely dinner that night. And there's this young guy from Korea who had started the Camino thinking this is like for exercise and to like think about things. And literally the day before he started walking, his girlfriend called him and dumped him via the phone. So his Camino became about getting over this relationship and this breakup. And so the Camino surprises you in so many ways. And there's just people from all walks of life. And if you are compelled to walk it, you have a question, but you might not necessarily be sure what that question even is.
Yeah, and sometimes I felt like I figured it out while people were walking when they didn't understand it themselves. Maybe I was imagining it quite often, but just little things that you got to know somebody after a while, and you would see how they would respond to things and say, oh, now I understand. I'm going to tell, I guess, two very short stories to hopefully finish this off. But the first thing that want to tell anybody who hasn't walked is that it is one of the most remarkable things of this experience is that you walk over that hill from Orason into Roncesvalles and people start talking to you about the craziest, deepest, darkest things in their life and
Yes.
with complete openness. And it doesn't always happen right away. Sometimes it happens later, but it's a torrent of what does Bill Bennett call it? He calls the entire thing one great big confession. It's just easy, and I don't know how to explain it. You would never talk about these things with your closest friends back home, but with perfect strangers on the Camino, not a problem, right? It just happens. When I was on the Meseta once, it was this really dusty bar in the middle of nowhere. I came across a minister. He was in the process of writing his daily log to his flock back home. And what I saw was a guy that was trying to, well, in his eyes, there was a little bit of panic because what was happening out there did not fit into the catechism that he was raised with and he was instructed to tell his flock. And I could see that in his eyes. So he was working to try and fit all of this stuff that was happening, and strange stuff in his head, into something that would actually be accepted to the people that he was supposed to lead. We all have these kinds of sensations when you're out there, and so that's going to happen. Anybody can go out there and find that as long as your mind stays open. And that's the last story, which is that in the second Camino I was on, there was this group of Danes that were walking together. Danes, by the way, are great to walk with. They had beer for breakfast, and they had beer for lunch, and they have beer for second lunch, and so. But this kid, that was kind of, well, he wasn't a leader, but he'd been on more Caminos than the rest of them. He'd done a Chicago 88 and a previous Camino, so he was on his third, and it was a long one. And we had a discussion about a guy that I had met once who was just doing it for exercise, and he was, yeah, well, if you decide to close your mind and make it about that, that's all it will be. But if you just open your mind up and let it wander, then interesting things are going to happen. You'll find that it'll mean something to you and not what you immediately expected. And I said, that's pretty good for a 22-year-old. And so I leave with that. And basically, anybody comes and walks from any religious background or not, you leave your mind open and you're going to discover things, unexpected things about yourself. And it's going to make you a different person when you get back.
There was a final section in my essay that ended up ultimately being cut, but it talks about how I went to Barcelona for a few days after my Camino. I've never been to the city. I'm just feeling very bereft. I think after the Camino ends, you feel exhausted and emptied in a way. And I was wandering through the city. It felt very strange to once again be walking in a city, not just, open plains or mountains. And I found a free photography exhibition that I just wandered into it. And on the second floor, there were a series of photographs that had been taken by a Czech photographer. I can't recall her name right now, of Irish pilgrims in the 70s. And this expression of simultaneous ecstasy and torture, in a sense, the pleasure and pain, and it's that sort of heightened sensation that I think it's hard to apply words to, but however you go into the Camino, you will be feeling the highs and lows in a way that will change you.
Thank you both. This was a little bit of an experiment. Like I said at the beginning, I wasn't sure how it would go, but I had hope, and it was better than I had expected. And that's a credit to both of you for being so great about playing off of each other, building off each other's ideas. And there is a lot of cool dialogue to be had between your two pieces. So thank you both for the time.
Best of luck with it, and good luck with your writing, Rian. I'm past the point in my career where I have to care so much about these things, but I certainly understand those days when everything seems to be going against you.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure to talk with both of you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, I could talk about the Camino all day, so this is great.
I know, we all can.
Episode titles are, I have to admit, sometimes a bit of an afterthought. The conversations get the bulk of the mental energy. The editing chews up the majority of the hours. And then once the opening and closing are recorded and tacked on and the final production pieces are added, I just want to get the darn thing online. So titles tend to go in one of two directions. Either a concrete description of the subject matter, or maybe an interesting line or phrase from the episode. This time, though, the title, Belief is Not a Zero-Sum Game, came to me in the aftermath of the conversation. It's easy to break the world into believers and non-believers, the religious and spiritually minded people on one side, and the atheists and the agnostics, the nuns, on the other. To me, though, Leonard and Rian's reflections on the Camino and belief exposed how faulty that sort of binary thinking is, as is so often the case when binaries are involved. Inexplicable phenomena, remarkable coincidences, deeper questions of meaning, confrontations with mortality, soul-searching periods of reflection. I mean, Leonard and Rian had all of those elements on their Caminos. Epiphany and transcendence? Maybe, maybe not. But the potential was created, I think. There's a line I liked at the end of Leonard's book. Reflecting on the gift of his pilgrimage, he writes that, quote, I can see the world through the eyes of spirituality. This is a change for him. And I would agree, that is a gift. I would hope, though, that when religious folks out there would see the world through Leonard and Rian's eyes, that they would see that the two worlds really aren't that different after all. That's all for this episode. Thanks again to Leonard Vance. You can find his book, An Atheist on Pilgrimage, Tales of Humanity from the Camino de Santiago, on Amazon. Thanks as well to Rian Sassin. You can find her article, Walking the Camino in the Shadow of Belief, online at thenation.com. And you can find all of her writing at Rian Sassin, RIANSASSEEN.com. All episodes of the Camino Podcast can be found on Spotify, Apple, SoundCloud, and YouTube. You can find me at CaminoPodcast@gmail.com and through the Camino Podcast Facebook page. And you can support the pod on Patreon at patreon.com/DaveLizzo. Back next week.